some people lack even a shred of compassion. Cruelty is second nature to them, especially when it comes to juvenile offenders capable of inhuman acts. The town of PelhamCity, located in Alabama, USA, has a population of around 25,000 and is surrounded by Native American lands. Despite its rich history, it is now a quiet town where life flows at its usual pace. No one expected that such a shocking and horrific event would occur in one of the houses. On March 23, 1996, at 9:33 a.m., 16-year-old Mark Duke called the police. In an agitated voice, he reported that he had found his father dead in their own home. Upon arriving at the scene, officers discovered not one, but 4 bodies. The first victim was 39-year-old Randy Duke, Mark's father. A bloody trail led the police to the kitchen, where there were no victims, but the largest kitchen knife was missing. On the second floor, following the blood trail, they entered the bathroom. There lay Randy's 29-year-old fiancée, Deidre Hunt, and next to her was her younger 6-year-old daughter, Chalisa. The older 7-year-old daughter, Chelsea, was found in the bedroom, also on the second floor. The adults had been shot, with Deidre's body literally riddled with bullets. The girls' throats had been slit. Casings from .32 and .45 caliber weapons were found at the crime scene. Post-mortem lividity indicated that the murders had occurred over 24 hours earlier. Mark, who had called the police, was immediately questioned. The boy said that he had returned home in the evening and found his father dead. Without going into details and not seeing the other victims, he immediately called 911. The teenager was taken to the police station to calm down and be safe, as there was a possibility that the killer might return. In addition, the police hoped to obtain valuable information from him for the investigation. Randy Duke was born in Chicago in January 1958, but grew up in Alabama. He was 10 years older than his fiancée Deidre, who was born in Alabama in July 1967 and had barely turned 29 at the time of her death. The couple was already engaged and planning their wedding. Deidre had 2 daughters less than a year apart in age. The girls looked very similar but had completely different personalities. Chelsea was active and energetic, while the younger Chalisa was calm and quiet. The investigators ruled out the possibility of an attack by Deidre's ex-husband out of jealousy. Everyone who knew these families was aware that the woman had managed to maintain a friendly relationship with her ex-husband. During the divorce and custody arrangements, they had no disputes. The children stayed with their father so as not to change schools, but their mother regularly picked them up on weekends. The former spouses had no conflicts over this matter. Nevertheless, the man was thoroughly vetted, but he had a solid alibi and was excluded from the list of suspects. Detectives considered Randy's secret work at the Drug Enforcement Bureau as a possible motive for the crime, as he assisted in countering local drug dealers. Could he have been killed out of a desire for revenge? But this line of investigation also yielded no results. Randy and Deidre had been a couple for over a year before the man finally decided to propose to his beloved. The young woman happily agreed to become his wife. Randy had a son from a previous marriage, Mark, who lived with his father. However, the reason the boy stayed with his dad was not that he didn't want to change schools. The real reason was that his biological mother had practically no interest in her son's life. She had left the family almost immediately after the child was born. Randy raised Mark on his own, and the boy's mother only visited him rarely. Months could pass between her visits. From the outside, Randy and Deidre seemed like an ordinary couple in love. The man sincerely accepted his fiancée's daughters, who spent weekends with them, and Deidre, in turn, tried to find common ground with her future husband's son. It seemed that the victims had no enemies, and such a brutal attack was completely unusual for this town. Crimes like this had never happened here before. The police immediately noticed that the items in the house were chaotically scattered, as if someone had committed a failed robbery. However, nothing of value was missing from the home. Money was left in plain sight. Something didn't add up. Why shed so much blood if the intruder's goal was theft? Why did he not spare even the children? The detectives were convinced that the killer was motivated by personal reasons. The local community was stunned by these events. This town had never experienced high-profile murders, so 4 bodies at once had a shocking effect on all the county residents. News of the tragedy spread through the town like wildfire. When forensic experts were removing the bodies from the house, a crowd of frightened neighbors had already gathered outside. Local residents were gripped by panic. The victims' relatives were in shock, because just 2 days before, Deidre and the girls had been at a family dinner. At that time, everything was fine, and nothing foreshadowed trouble. Chalisa was preparing for her first beauty pageant, while Chelsea was carefreely playing board games. No one could have imagined that this meeting would be their last. At the press conference regarding this crime, the police refrained from making loud statements. The versions considered were 4 murders or a triple murder followed by a suicide. Such assumptions were based on the initial data collected at the bloody massacre site. The fact is that no signs of forced entry into the house were found. Therefore, from the very beginning of the investigation, the possibility of an attack by an outsider was excluded. The killer could only be someone from the family or a close circle of acquaintances who were trusted enough to open the door without hesitation. At the end of the press conference, law enforcement officials announced a $20,000 reward for any information that would help in apprehending the perpetrator. The relatives of the deceased categorically rejected the police's suggestion that the man could have voluntarily taken his own life. Randy was calm and level-headed. He would never have done such a thing. None of the family members suffered from mental disorders or harmful addictions. It was evident that someone else had done this. Moreover, judging by the use of weapons of 2 different calibers, there were at least 2 criminals. To obtain valuable information, the police questioned the neighbors, but unfortunately, none of them had heard or seen anything suspicious on the day of the tragedy. Meanwhile, the medical examiner completed the autopsy of the bodies. It was determined that the cause of death for Randy and Deidre was gunshot wounds. A bullet had knocked out the woman's teeth, and the children had choked on their own blood after their throats were cut. Judging by the numerous defensive wounds on her hands, Chelsea had desperately tried to fight back. During the autopsy, several non-fatal gunshot wounds were also found on the girl's body. The bullets matched the casings found at the crime scene. Forensic experts spent over 30 hours thoroughly examining the victim's house. Blood was everywhere, indicating that the attack had been carried out in a state of frenzied rage. Obviously, it was someone close to the family who had come to kill, driven by a strong personal motive. While investigators were collecting evidence, detectives were simultaneously communicating with Mark Duke, the teenager who had called 911 and was currently under police protection. However, the longer the young man was under the supervision of law enforcement, the more his composure surprised them. He acted as if nothing had happened, telling funny stories and jokes, and seemingly not at all concerned about the death of his family members. With each subsequent conversation, the police's suspicions about Mark only grew. Meanwhile, Mark's 14-year-old girlfriend came to the police station and told them that the boy had confessed to her about killing his own family. The girl was invited for an interview. At the precinct, she told the detectives that not only Mark, but also his friends were involved in the crime. She also shared other details about the brutal massacre. The teenager's friend agreed to record conversations of Mark's friends discussing the specifics of what they had done. These recordings gave the police sufficient grounds to call Mark and his buddies in for questioning. During the investigation, it was discovered that the 16-year-old young man had serious problems in his relationships with his family members. Several neighbors and acquaintances reported that there were frequent conflicts between the teenager, his father, stepmother, and her daughters. Most of the arguments were with his father, who was dissatisfied with his son's behavior both at school and at home. There were even witnesses who had heard Mark threaten to kill Randy. According to Mark himself, on the day of the tragedy, he was spending time with his friends. They went to the movies together. To support his words, the boy even showed a ticket stub, hoping that it would be his reliable alibi. However, the medical examiner's conclusion nullified the story. The murders had occurred not on March 23rd, as initially thought, but 36 hours before the police arrived at the victim's house. When new facts came to light, Mark was forced to admit that he had not stayed at home for several days. According to him, just before the massacre, he was hanging out with 19-year-old Brandon Samra, 17-year-old Michael Ellison, and another 17-year-old friend, David Collins. This foursome was inseparable and was known in town as a troubled group. All the boys were questioned one by one at the police station. During a conversation with detectives, Brandon almost immediately cracked. He told them about a chilling dialogue that had taken place between him and his 16-year-old friend, Mark Duke. Brandon knew that Mark had serious problems with his father, who constantly put pressure on him. The biggest arguments between them arose over Mark's poor performance in school and the crowd he was hanging out with. Of course, the young man was rebelling against his father's authority, as is typical for that age. but no one could have imagined what this confrontation would lead to. On March 22nd, the whole gang gathered together. They visited the home of Randy Duke, Mark's father, and the boy asked his permission to take the pickup truck to ride around with his friends. But the man refused. As soon as the group walked away from the house, Mark became incredibly angry. That's when he confessed to the guys that he had long been hatching a plan to kill his father. Moreover, he had already gotten his hands on a .45 caliber pistol somewhere. Michael Ellison, in turn, obtained a .32 caliber weapon. Where the teenagers got these pistols from is not exactly known, but it is assumed that they were stolen. Mark carefully wiped each bullet and both pistols to avoid leaving fingerprints. Michael did the same. But alas, none of the friends had the sense to dissuade Mark from this terrible idea, or at least warn his relatives. Upon arriving at the Duke residence, Mark took the .45 caliber pistol in his hands, while Brandon held the .32 caliber weapon. The young man was filled with determination and stressed that the entire family, all four of them, had to die. Two armed teenagers entered the house through the back door, while the rest of the gang waited outside. As soon as the intruders were inside, they immediately encountered Randy. Mark fired but missed, and the man managed to throw a heavy statuette from the table at him. Unfortunately, this failed to knock the gun out of the attacker's hands. The young man fired 2 more times, and both bullets hit their target. The father fell dead. Brandon recounted that, at that moment, the killer shouted for Randy to go to hell. At the same time, Brandon saw Dedra, who was standing near Randy at the time of the attack, in the sights of his pistol. The bullet hit the woman in the face, but only grazed her slightly. The mother grabbed her daughters and rushed upstairs, hoping to hide on the 2nd floor. The teenagers continued shooting. To their great regret, Dedra did not manage to escape. 2 bullets hit her in the back, one of which inflicted a fatal wound. Despite her serious injuries, the woman used her last strength to put up a desperate resistance, trying to protect her children. She managed to crawl to the 2nd floor and hide with her younger daughter, Chalisa, in the bathroom. The older Chelsea ran to the bedroom and hid under the bed. After making sure that his father was dead, Mark went upstairs, where Brandon already was. He was unsuccessfully trying to break down the bathroom door. Together, the underage killers managed to force their way inside, and Brandon finished off Dedra with another shot. At this point, they ran out of ammunition, so Mark grabbed a knife he had taken from the kitchen. With it, he slit 6-year-old Chalisa's throat twice. The frenzied monsters did not stop there. Now they were looking for the older girl, Chelsea. Unfortunately, her hiding place turned out to be unreliable. Upon discovering the child under the bed, the teenagers pulled her out. The girl desperately fought back and managed to inflict about 15 stab wounds to her left arm and 3 more to her right before Mark restrained her. The stepbrother held the victim with her head pulled back, and Brandon, despite her pleas for mercy, cold-bloodedly slashed Chelsea's throat. After this brutal massacre, the subhumans washed the blood off their hands. Mark took both pistols and swiped his father's wallet, after which they left the crime scene. Tossing the knife into a storm drain, the group got into Randy's pickup truck and went to hang out as if nothing had happened. The next day, all 4 of them went to the movie theater to watch the horror film, Scream. They even kept the tickets to use later as an alibi. After that, the thugs returned to the Duke house to stage a robbery. They rummaged through the entire dwelling, stole some items, and deliberately made a mess. When the rest of the criminals left, Mark called 911, pretending that he had just returned home and discovered the bloody carnage. When Brandon recounted this chilling story, both young killers were arrested. By March 26th, they were charged with the premeditated brutal murder of 4 people, which under Alabama state law was punishable by death via lethal injection. Initially, Mark refused the appointment of a lawyer, but he was later provided with a defense attorney, as required by procedure. The police managed to quickly solve this case, so at the time of the arrest, the teenager's scratches, received in the struggle with the desperate Chelsea in her final moments, had not even healed yet. Under the tortured child's fingernails, forensic experts found skin particles belonging to Mark and Brandon, which became another piece of evidence of their guilt. The local community was shocked when they learned who was really behind this brutal murder. People could not believe that such young creatures were capable of displaying such cruelty. Particularly striking was the inhumanly cold-blooded manner in which they massacred the little girls. It defied comprehension. Within a few days, the police detained two more minors, Michael Ellison and David Collins, Mark's friends. The 17-year-old boys were charged with complicity. All four were held behind bars and denied bail, as they posed an extreme danger to society. As it was later revealed, all these teenagers were members of a youth gang consisting of about 10 individuals. 19-year-old Brandon was the oldest among them, but surprisingly, he was not the leader. The young man agreed to kill an entire family without hesitation, just to strengthen his authority in the eyes of the other gang members. Investigators discovered that symbols indicating the gang's involvement were carved on the walls of the Duke house. Despite all efforts, the investigation was unable to determine whether other members of the gang had directly participated in the massacre. It is only known that they all had problems in school, and some had already been held responsible for less serious crimes. Mark, for example, was a participant in a special community program for troubled teens. The other three, Brandon, Michael, and David, had dropped out of school altogether. Brandon had also run away from home after his parents tried to forcibly send him for treatment for drug addiction, which he had acquired while still in school. The defendant's lawyer tried to evoke sympathy from the jury and secure a more lenient sentence. The defense attorney claimed that Mark had become violent due to a difficult childhood. Allegedly, problems with his father began shortly before the tragedy, when the teenager tried to join his father's business. Randy was engaged in repairs and worked for himself, so he wanted to make his son his assistant. But that's when the boy's difficult character manifested itself. As for Mark's mother, she had essentially abandoned her son when he was still an infant. The woman left the family when the boy was only 6 months old and subsequently visited him only rarely. The last time she saw Mark was 3 months before the massacre. Such neglect from his own mother undoubtedly became a real trauma for the child. Psychologists suggested that against the background of problematic relationships with his parents, the appearance of Dedra and her daughters could have become a triggering event. Brandon's trial began in mid-March 1998. The defendant did not plead guilty, citing insanity. The accused's interests in court were represented by a state-appointed lawyer. At the very beginning of the hearings, the defense attorney filed a motion to change the venue of the sessions, citing excessive publicity of the case. But the court rejected this demand. The prosecutors had strong evidence, a recorded confession from Brandon in which he described his actions during the crime in detail. However, the accused later recanted his words. The lawyer insisted that the young man was influenced by mental deviations, as well as pressure from other gang members who forced him to slander himself. A court-appointed psychiatrist was assigned to conduct a psychiatric evaluation of Brandon. The doctor carefully examined the defendant and, based on the results, compiled an extensive 21-page report. In the conclusion, the specialist noted that Brandon was sane at the time of committing the crime. Additionally, an MRI scan of the accused's brain was performed, which also did not reveal any pathological changes. The teenager demonstrated completely adequate behavior and was aware of the consequences of his actions. Despite the lawyer's persistent attempts to prove his client's insanity, this line of defense failed. The defense attorney then decided to focus on another aspect. He drew the jury's attention to Brandon's low level of intelligence. After all, the young man's IQ was only 73, which was confirmed by the results of working with a clinical psychologist and the conclusion of a certified forensic expert. Due to his delayed mental development, the teenager was highly susceptible to the influence of other gang members, which ultimately pushed him to participate in this horrible murder. Moreover, Brandon had not previously had serious problems with the law. During the investigation, it was also discovered that the 19-year-old defendant often used various satanic symbols. The defense lawyer wanted to demonstrate these drawings to the jury, hoping to prove the immaturity and mental retardation of his client. It should be noted that at that time in America, there was a surge in youth's fascination with Satanism. The interviewed psychologists assumed that Brandon perceived all this symbolism purely as an element of a game. Several specialists reached this conclusion after communicating with the defendant. However, this move by the lawyer led to the opposite effect. Instead of seeing Brandon as a mentally unstable, troubled young man, the jury began to perceive him as the embodiment of the devil himself. It would seem that nothing could further harm the defendant's reputation, but in reality, it was this miscalculation by the defense that determined the outcome of the entire trial. Brandon's relatives also came to the hearing. The young man's sister and father insisted that they could never have expected such cruelty and cold-bloodedness from him. They were shocked that the boy was capable of such brutality. After all, Brandon had not previously shown a propensity for violence or other serious offenses. The defendant's father said that he first suspected something was wrong when Brandon was in 7th grade. That's when the man found out that his son had started smoking marijuana. He gave the boy an ultimatum: either he goes to rehab or he gets out of the house. Brandon chose the latter. In high school, the young man did try to go through an appropriate program, but then he ran away from home again. As a result, he never received a high school diploma. It cannot be unequivocally stated whether the defense lawyer made these mistakes intentionally, but objectively, they only hastened the triumph of justice. After a brief deliberation, 10 out of 12 jurors found that 20-year-old Brandon Samra had no right to life. A year after the trial ended, he was sentenced to the death penalty. Mark's trial began 2 years after the horrific massacre that claimed the lives of 4 people. All the young people who were involved in the investigation and gave testimony unanimously claimed that it was Mark who initiated the attack on his own father. There was no doubt about this. The boy had planned and led this brutal assault. From the very beginning, the prosecutors built their case based on the testimony of Mark's gang friends, Michael, David, and Brandon. It was believed that the reason for the outburst of aggression was the father's refusal to lend his son the family pickup truck for entertainment with his friends, as well as years of accumulated anger and resentment toward his relatives. Thanks to the thorough work of forensic experts who painstakingly collected and examined all the traces left at the crime scene, it was possible to reconstruct a complete picture of those chilling events. All the evidence indicated the truthfulness of the confessions of the other participants in the bloody massacre. The prosecution's evidence base was so strong and comprehensive that Mark's lawyer did not even try to prove his client's innocence. Instead, the tactic chosen was to seek the most lenient sentence possible. The defense attorney tried to play on the fact that Randy Duke was a cruel, alcoholic father who had abused his son for years. Allegedly, Mark's teenage psyche could not withstand such pressure, and at some point, the cup of patience overflowed, which pushed him to an armed attack. However, this version in no way explained why Mark also killed Dedra and her 2 innocent daughters. After hearing all the arguments of the parties, the jury went to the deliberation room to determine the verdict. However, they only needed about half an hour for discussion. On March 3, 1999, the jury unanimously found 18-year-old Mark Duke guilty of committing premeditated murders. Moreover, they recommended sentencing the teenager to the death penalty, despite the fact that at the time of the crime, he had not yet reached the age of majority. Ultimately, the court agreed with this position and made the final verdict. The underage killer was to be executed. In 1999, Brandon Samra, the second direct perpetrator of the murders, filed an appeal against the death sentence but was denied. Michael Ellison and David Collins, who were sentenced to 16 years in prison for complicity, petitioned for parole in 2004 after serving 6 years, but their request was also rejected. Both were able to be released only in 2013, having fully served their assigned punishment. Mark Duke filed several appeal petitions asking to replace the death penalty with life imprisonment, but each time he was refused. But suddenly, in 2005, the U.S. Supreme Court made a decision that radically changed the convict's fate. As part of the consideration of another high-profile case, a precedent was set: a ban on the use of capital punishment for persons who had not reached the age of 18 at the time of committing a particularly serious crime. This automatically overturned Mark's death sentence. From now on, he could hope to live out his days, albeit behind bars. To this day, Mark Duke is serving a life sentence at the St. Clair Correctional Facility in the city of Springville, Alabama. But for the second shooter, Brandon Samra, this innovation did not help. At the time of the double murder, he was already 19 years old, so the death sentence remained in force. While serving his sentence on Alabama's death row in 2019, Brandon made a final attempt to appeal the court's decision, but he was denied again, and this happened literally days before the scheduled execution date. On May 16, 2019, 42-year-old Brandon Samra was administered a lethal injection. Before departing into eternity, he managed to utter a few short words: "I would like to thank Jesus for everything I have." After the injection, the condemned man was dying for an unusually long time. a whole 27 minutes. One of the lawyers involved in Brandon's case said that literally a few days before his client's execution, a glimmer of hope for salvation appeared. The defenders tried until the very end to save the life of this killer, because up until the moment of committing the terrible crime, he had only minor offenses on his record and no serious problems with the law. Hope was given by a bill signed by the state governor in 2017. The document prohibited disregarding the votes of jurors who spoke in favor of life imprisonment rather than the death penalty if there were less than 12 of them. And in Brandon's situation, that was exactly the case. 2 out of 12 jurors voted to give him a life sentence. But Alabama is a conservative state, and according to local rules, even in such a case, the judge could insist on the death penalty. So although the lawyers fought for Brandon's life until the end, arguing that due to serious cognitive impairments, he did not fully realize his actions during the attack, it was all in vain. A lot of criticism from lawyers and the public was also directed at the work of Brandon's attorney during the first trial. The defense lawyer made several unfortunate mistakes, in particular, mentioning the defendant's fascination with satanic symbolism, which had an extremely negative impact on the jury's opinion. The lawyer's explanation was as follows. He allegedly wanted to demonstrate the client's emotional immaturity, but the effect was the opposite. These details only brought the death sentence closer. Many people also pointed out the obvious injustice committed by the court. After all, despite the fact that it was Mark Duke who was the organizer and main initiator of the brutal family massacre, he was punished more leniently than his accomplice. Many people were inclined to believe that Brandon, due to his mental retardation, could not adequately assess the situation and make informed decisions at all. Psychologists noted his strong dependence on his surroundings and inability to act independently without guidance from more authoritative individuals. So, if it hadn't been for Mark, who basically manipulated his friend, Brandon most likely would never have committed such a terrible crime, and it would have been logical if the organizer had received a harsher sentence than the perpetrator. The adoption of the law on mitigating punishments for juvenile offenders sparked heated discussions in society. Many people wondered, can a person's maturity be determined solely on the basis of passport data? And what about those like Brandon Samra, mentally retarded with the intellect of a 13-year-old child? In some states, according to local legislation, an 18-year-old citizen can be executed or allowed to vote in elections, but at the same time, he does not have the right to purchase alcohol. Isn't that absurd? These contradictions became particularly acute against the backdrop of the bloody events at the Duke House. However, there were also those who believed that justice was restored in this story, and the punishment fully corresponded to the crime committed. The relatives of the victims considered the sentence to be rightful revenge. They stressed, how can one justify with mental disabilities the fact that Brandon shot the defenseless Dedra several times and then slashed the throat of a little girl with his own hands while an accomplice held her for convenience? He did this voluntarily, without any coercion, and therefore he deserved adequate punishment for his atrocities.